We're not electing a pastor-in-chief. That was one of the main criticisms of my now infamous December 2019 Christianity Today editorial, in which I argued that President Trump is morally unfit for office. We don't elect political leaders for their morals, goes the sentiment, but for their ability to get things done. To many so-called realists, anyone who suggests that moral leadership is just as necessary as political skill is considered, well, woefully naive. If so, a whole school of political philosophers, starting with Aristotle, don't know what they're talking about. Such critics are inspired, of course, by Machiavelli, who argued that in a hostile and brutal world, political leaders are not merely justified by, but are required to lie, cheat, or otherwise do wrong to get things done. Of course, anyone who has been a leader knows that one does not have to play moral idealism off against realpolitik. They've had moments when they are faced not with a simple choice of good versus evil, but a choice sometimes between two goods, and worse, sometimes between two evils. And they must choose the greater good or the lesser evil. At such moments, a leader's ethics and wisdom are more crucial than ever. So we don't have to deny the moral complexity of leadership to insist that we need men and women of character to lead us. Which is why it's natural to seek leaders who do not lie or steal, who are faithful to their spouse and friends and political allies, men and women who prize doing their duty over political expediency. A populace can hardly trust leaders if such baseline ethics are habitually violated. Well, at the same time, we know human nature, and nobody expects leaders to be pastors-in-chief. To be fair and to be realistic, some of our most effective presidents and social justice champions have struggled in one or more of these areas of personal morality. Longing for moral leadership is like the line from the Pledge of Allegiance that talks about liberty and justice for all. This is not, sadly, a description of the way things already are, but an ideal toward which we continually strive as a nation. The list of virtues needed in leadership are many, of course: courage, patience, forbearance, among others. Yet at this perilous moment in our history, there is one moral virtue that is needed more than ever. It was one modeled by Abraham Lincoln at the end of the Civil War, when he said in his second inaugural address that as he strove, quote, to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, with all the firmness in the right as God gives us, we should not judge, lest we be judged. And he continued with those famous words that we should proceed with malice toward none, with charity for all. This trait was modeled by the United States government when it created the Marshall Plan at the end of World War II to help a devastated Europe, including the nation that had taken over 200,000 American lives in battle and had murdered millions of Jews out of mere spite. As George Marshall put it, our policy is not directed against any country, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. It was also modeled by the great John Lewis, recently deceased civil rights warrior, who talked about how to heal the deep wounds left by any injustice. It is a love, he said, that accepts and embraces the hateful and the hurtful. It is a love that recognizes the spark of the divine in each of us, even in those who would raise their hands against us, those we might call our enemy. It is the ability to see through those layers of ugliness, to see further into a person than a person can see into himself. Lewis, of course, was inspired by Martin Luther King Jr., who said in regard to his lifelong crusade, "The problem is not a purely racial one, with Negroes set against whites. In the end, it is not a struggle between people at all, but a tension between justice and injustice." He went on to say, A mass movement exercising nonviolence is an object lesson in power under discipline, a demonstration to the community that if such a movement attained a degree of strength, it would use its power creatively and not vengefully. In short, the most important moral trait of a political leader, especially in times of deep conflict, is that they not use power for vengeance, but for justice grounded in mercy. It's a refusal to treat others with whom one disagrees as enemies, but only as opponents. It is to remember that even our opponents are created in the image of God, and despite their views and projects that we find unsavory, they still retain an inherent dignity we are called to respect. Among the many moral failings of our current president, his failure in this regard is most egregious. Just take his Twitter feed alone. Mr. Trump habitually ridicules his opponents, describing them as unhinged, crazy, lying, disgraced, losers, crooked, phony, fake, and his favorite, people of low IQ. His comments, which rage every day of the year and many times during the day, are the epitome of contempt for other human beings. Those who disagree with him are enemies who should be humiliated. He claims to be pro-life and yet has no respect whatsoever for the lives of those who disagree with him. He is the most divisive, mean-spirited, and vengeful president in the history of the United States. One might argue he makes Richard Nixon look like a saint. And while it's true that national divisiveness precedes his presidency, who cannot help but see that he has made our divisions only ever deeper? We now look across a great chasm with hate for one another, so that the American experiment in democracy threatens to collapse. But let us not judge, lest we be judged. We who seek to displace Mr. Trump from office are tempted by a great irony. In the cause of repudiating his moral legacy, we may merely sustain it by mirroring his caustic behavior. We are wise to remember that Donald Trump is also made in God's image, as are all his advisors, as are Republicans who have sold their souls to sidle up to power, as are white supremacists emboldened by his contempt of others, as are those evangelicals, my brothers and sisters in faith, who talk about Mr. Trump in messianic terms. Now, this doesn't mean we should become models of sunshine and sweetness, ignoring injustice and immoral leadership for the sake of a false peace. No, far from it. But it does mean we should not talk about our opponents as if the only solution is that they need an exorcism. In short, let us fight not to humiliate them and then glory in our own victory, but so that justice and peace may prevail for all. And if our anger is too deeply embedded in our hearts and in bitterness we cannot think of them as anything but enemies, well, okay, I get it. Let us then at least remember the bracing words of the one who called us to love not just our neighbors, but also our enemies. We will not have any right to take up moral leadership in any capacity, from the local school board to Congress to the presidency, if in achieving a strategic victory we simply seek to punish the losers. Bearing as they do the imprint of divine dignity, we respect them still, not because they are right, but in spite of the fact that we believe them wrong, catastrophically wrong in some cases. We do so with the hope of healing a nation afflicted with the pandemic of polarization and helping us once again to become a people whose pursuit of justice and truth is ever tempered by mercy. Thank you.